Welcome to today's session and welcome to Exchange. Exchange is, as you know, based at Cardiff University, and as the title suggests, it's about exchanging information and knowledge between practitioners, academics, experts by experience, and policymakers. So really pleased to have you here. I'm particularly excited today to be talking about community work, something that is very close to my heart and something that, you know, we really want to see back on the social care agenda. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Fiona Verity and really looking forward to today's session. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Alison. Just to echo your comments about how wonderful it is to be at a session that's about community development and social work. So thank you to the organisers for having me as part of this session. So I'm kicking off, and I've decided to focus in on that question about what can social work learn from community development and community development from social work, and come at it from that angle. So just to preface my comments, I come from a community development background. So I work at Swansea University, Professor of Social Work, Social Care. I'm Australian. I'm actually dialing in from Australia at the moment, which is where I've been since the lockdown. So I'm here in Australia. So my background was community development. So I worked as a community development worker before I did my social work training. So I went to do social work, and then from social work went back and practiced as a community development worker. So for me, social work and community development have always been connected. They've been connected in my mind, connected in values, connected in theories, connected in practice. And certainly when I read the International Federation definition of social work, talking about social change, empowerment, addressing inequalities, and looking at some of the recent global agendas, in my mind, community development is very, firmly in that agenda and an important method of social work. I've been interested in my particular kind of research area. I've been interested in social work history, particularly the history of sociology and community development in social work. And when I go back to look at some of that history and read some of the early kind of pioneer social work writers, so reformers like Jane Addams and Alice Solomon from Germany and others from across the planet, in my reading, community development was always an intrinsic part of the social work approach and social work ideas. So it can be traced back to the origins of social work, where community development or collective approaches were in the mix of what it is that there was this thing called social work. And David Burnham's written a really good paper called Selective Memory, a note on social work historiography. And he cites Professor Vivian Cree, who wrote that in 1900, social work was anything and everything, from casework of the charitable organisation societies to the social reform-based settlement movement to the institutional care provided by a large number of the poor laws and voluntary agencies. So in my mind, as somebody who's keen on community development, I think it's really important to be reminded of that history and anchored to that history of community development and social work. And certainly if we look at different theories and paradigms, even if you're working on an individual orientation, there's an agenda for social change, whether it's radical or transformative. But over time, that connection between social work and community development has really waxed and waned. And I've seen that in my own country of Australia, where I've done my practice. We've had periods where community development was to the fore in social work, and then when it's retreated. And certainly, I think we're in a period now in some countries like Australia where it has retreated. So places that were really strong on community development, where you were allowed to be part of supporting social action as well as locality-based community development, it's shrunk to a role of case management, which is important, but that ability to attend to social contextual factors and work for the person and the environment has really shrunk. So when I was thinking about what I could offer as a kind of preface to hearing from the practitioners we're going to hear from, the case examples, is I went to the social work literature and I trawled through and I just picked out two papers about community development. So 2 papers from social work journals, one from the British Journal of Social Work, written by Keith Popples. So he's a professor of social work at London South Bank University and author of the book Analysing Community Work from 1995. And he wrote a paper in 2006 entitled Community Development in the 21st Century, a Case of Conditional Development. So I want to just overview some of his ideas and then pick up a paper from the Australian Journal of Social Work that was published late last year online, but in print in 2020. And these are writers who are really lamenting what's happened in social work with the loss of community development, and that it's really important that we pull it back into practice. So first of all, Keith Popples' paper. He has a pattern of doing critical commentary on community development and sort of a bit of an assessment about where it's up to. So he wrote this paper 6 years into the new century, and he approached it by doing painting a picture of contextual factors. So Labor was in power, there was accelerated globalisation, so looking at the geopolitical context in which community development is being located, and really talking about the fact that under the new Labor agenda, particularly the banner of social exclusion, there was this real thrust forward for community development. Programs were being funded, monies were flowing, an expansion of schemes. But in his critical assessment of it, and he draws on the works of 3 community development writers to pull his case together, but he analyses what he calls conditional community development. So from his assessment, community development having 2 objectives. Yes, I've just been asked to put the names of the papers in the chat, and I'll do that when I've finished. So 2 objectives for community development, so at this time in 2006. So one is community development to support local initiatives, local participatory processes, supporting and building civil society. And then on the other hand, community development in a more prescriptive way, so a government agenda, whether it's talking about as social exclusion or promoting health or neighbourhood regeneration, but as kind of top down, to use that language, community development agendas. And what he was pointing to in his debate or his argument is that some of the top down prescribed community development, it's inherent in that is constraint. So there's a tension between what is prescribed and what is kind of necessary and what local people wish and want to do. He also talks about the language. So the language of the time being the language of, particularly in the social exclusion debates, the language of deprivation, so deprived communities and deprivation, and community development being a method and an approach and a kind of quest to address some of these issues. Now that language...
2 minutes.
Sorry, what was that?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Yeah. Holy moly. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the language of community development as deprivation. And that is at odds with an asset-based community development approach, and we're going to hear more about that. The second paper published this year is a real core, and this is published in 2020, looking at 2 case studies, one in Australia, one in Ireland. And by this stage, those initiatives have gone. We've had the global financial crisis, austerity, cuts across the board. And what these writers are saying is that it's really critical that community development comes back into the space of resisting and critiquing and reflecting on government agendas for community development and getting behind supporting local initiatives. So they talk about the need to view and practice community development as resistant spaces. So that's kind of got echoes there of Paulo Freire and his ideas about community development. To question the social policy trends that stymie the pursuit of social justice and human rights, and develop alternative worldviews and practices. So in my minute left, just a bit of a story. Peter Kenyon has got an initiative called the Bank of Ideas, and he tells the story of a town in New Zealand called Bull that was having a tough time economically. And they realised that one of the assets in their town was their name. It was called Bull. So because of that, what they did is they went round and rebranded all of their clubs and facilities and shops using the word bull. So there's a shop called Full as a Bull. The veterinarian clinic is called Animal Hostable. The library is called Readable, and the church is called Forgivable. And I really like that particular story because to me it illustrates something really powerful about asset-based community development. So I've just set a bit of a scene. I'll put those papers in the chat, but I'll hand over now to our next speaker, Dave Horton. So thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me. Tell me if you can't. I'm going to share some slides, so again, tell me if you can't see them. Hope you can see that. My name is Dave Horton. I'm a community worker in Alienkairos on the west of Cardiff. I live in Cairo as well with my family. And ACE is an organisation based in Cardiff in a building called the Dusty Forge. And I'm basically going to tell you a little bit about how we work today, just really briefly, why we set the organisation up, what our values and our philosophy is, and what that means in practice. But I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Ollie, who works at Cardiff University, and we work very closely together on a asset-based heritage project called Kaya Heritage. And Ollie's really going to go into quite a bit more detail on one particular project that we've developed together as a kind of example of how this asset-based approach works. No, thank goodness for that. I thought I wasn't going to move on for a minute. Okay, so quick introduction. Some of you may know Alienkairos, a really large housing estate on the west of Cardiff, population of about 26,000. Really interesting history in the area. Ely was built after the First World War on garden village principles, and Cairo after the Second World War under Bevan's kind of housing schemes. So really interesting, quite radical social housing policy that is at the foundation of kind of Alienkairos history. And we had lots of employment in the area, including the largest paper mill in Europe, Ely Paper Mill, which I think had about 450 to 500 employees when it closed in the 1990s. Chiller's Jam and Pickle Factory, a couple of brickworks, lots and lots of well-grounded, rooted employers based in the community who provided sustainable, secure, well-paid work, and they were quite integrated into the community in interesting ways. And all that was lost through the kind of 80s and 90s. And I guess we have a legacy of unemployment, and in particular, an issue that's got worse in the last kind of 10 years. We've seen it happen while we've been here. Issues of in-work poverty, so people struggling with the fact that they work, but it tends to be now in city centre-based social services kind of work, social sector kind of work, services sector, I mean, insecure, often part-time, low paid. So we get people coming in and out of the centre, kind of training up to do construction-based work in a 3-week contract and then back looking for work again. And we get a whole range of issues around low income, people on and off benefits and getting into debt because they're behind with benefit payments and that kind of stuff. So there's lots of issues related to poverty. And we established the organisation through the Communities First programme, Welsh Government Communities First programme, community work they've been developing through that programme. But importantly, as a way of putting that community work in the hands of local people, enabling them to have something rooted right in the community that could manage projects, employ staff, run buildings and generate income. So what's our philosophy? We're very much about having roots right in a local, we're very place-based roots in a local community. And what that means in practice is we base all our work on a network of relationships and on sort of principles of social capital, really. And that is both the grounding kind of infrastructure for how we work and enables us to do what we do, but it's also an outcome itself. So creating extended social capital for people both within the community and into groups that they wouldn't otherwise have contact with is a fundamental part of what we do and how we solve kind of local challenges. But I guess what I'd say, if I was asked to say what we're about in one sort of concept, it's really challenging this idea that's been associated with our community and communities like it, that our community is a problem that needs solving by people from the outside. And what we find is that once a community owns that kind of narrative, the individuals within it begin to own that narrative, and they see themselves as not people who have something to contribute, who are kind of unique, and that we all need to be part of a solution to local problems and to building community, but people who need services and things done for them. And we're really trying to undermine that with what we call an asset-based approach in the face of that sort of traditional deficit-based approach. And fundamental to that is notions of co-production and how we do things with people, not kind of to or for them. And the concept that everybody has something to contribute. So whenever we gather our membership, we're a member-based organisation, we give them that message really strongly. Everyone has something to contribute, and if anyone is unable to contribute for any reason, then everybody loses out as a result. And that's the kind of underpinning principle of everything we do. And as a result, we've been able to build an organisation that's led by local people as staff, trustees, volunteers, members, participants. And it's really a kind of very much a grassroots, locally run organisation where people grow and develop their skills and are able to contribute. And we take a holistic approach to the challenges that we're realistic about. Being asset-based doesn't mean that we deny that there are challenges in our community. We take a holistic approach to tackling those using the assets and resources that we have in our community. Really quick, just to touch on what we mean by assets, we have a very broad definition of that. We're talking about social networks that exist, and those are very strong in Ely because it's not a transitory community. People tend to live here all their lives and have family here. Our skills, knowledge, experience, and creativity. Our organisation itself is an asset now, and other organisations in the area. You'll hear a bit more about how we see sort of heritage and culture and looking at that in quite a unique way as a real asset and something we can build on and make work for the benefit of our community. And then things like buildings, land and equipment, you know, the bouncy castle stuck at the back of the church hall, you know, all that stuff that gets unused but could be brought into use to build community, and people's time as an asset. I'm not going to talk about Dusty Forge, but it's our community centre, and it's a good example, I guess, of how that comes together in a place that's become a home of community asset-based approach. It's our major asset, one of our major assets, and we've developed it in a kind of DIY approach with local people, you know, bringing rooms back into use and turning it into a thriving kind of centre. I'm just going to finish because my guess is I'm coming up to the 2-minute mark. Just talking about the role of stories and how important that is in what we do, and how we've been able to build that as a kind of fundamental aspect of our research and monitoring and evaluation. One of the things we're trying to do all the time, and this is a really strong theme in our Kaya Heritage project, is tell a different story about our community. A classic example of this for us is that Ely has been associated with an incident that happened in 1990, which came to be known as the Ely riots or the bread riots, which was the 3 or 4 nights of disturbances on the streets in North Ely, about the time there were similar incidences happening around the UK. And that story has become associated with our community in a really damaging and unhelpful way, and a very stigmatizing way. And a really good example of what that looks like in practice is about 6 or 7 years ago. It was the 25th anniversary, so it would have been sort of 2015 of the Ely riots. And even then, the local paper, the South Wales Echo, had a double-page spread about the Ely riots with all the old photos coming out, and kind of it was just dragging up something that for the community itself is just long in the past. And actually, people's interpretations of what happened locally are very different from what you see when you read in the papers. So that's a kind of story that's become associated with our community and that you kind of carry around as a burden. So what we're trying to do is tell a different story about our community and our heritage, and the particular role of Cairo at the centre of the development of Cardiff historically is a different story that actually is an empowering story for people who get to tell it together and to own it. So we're really trying to tell a different story about our community, and one of our key ways of doing that is to enable, as part of that process, individuals to tell a different story about themselves, and to kind of seize the initiative in their lives and to make a contribution in the context of community action, and to tell a different story about how they relate to their community and to the world around them and how they live their lives. And what we find is when people are able to do that, when we're able to identify with someone their particular skills and interests and talents and passions, and we're able to support them to put that into action in the context with other people and to make a contribution to a collective community-led action and to celebrate those contributions, that is when we see the most substantial and significant transformation for individuals. And it often extends through whole families. And I'm going to give you a really quick example of that in a minute. But that's where we see real change, and that's what we're looking to tap into all the time. And we've been able to work with Nick, who's on this call, and Nick Andrews, good friend of ours, to build that storytelling approach into our monitoring and evaluation using something called most significant change. So we collect individual stories of change, and we asked them what the most significant changes for them from their perspective as a part of being as a result of being involved in ACE's work, and they unpacked that for us and with us. And then we use panels of people to discuss and compare those stories, and those panels include local people and staff and partners, and to understand and draw learning from that around what was the significant thing that made the change for that person. So we've been able to build those stories into our monitoring and evaluation processes, and they're fundamental now to how we work. But also that collecting and sharing of stories has become a really important part of celebrating change, of enabling people to become role models for others in their community.
About 30 seconds, Dave.
Quick story then, Billy's story. He's the guy in the middle on the picture on the right with the cap. He came to us about 5 years ago, unemployed. He'd been on job seekers allowance and was told he had to get 6 months of voluntary work, which is compulsory, 30 hours a week. He begged us for a volunteer placement. He'd been unemployed for about 10 years at least. Had 2 lads in the house who were suffering from depression as he was, and were isolated in their rooms playing computer games. Billy came and did some maintenance and work for us. He was brilliant. We very quickly established he had real people skills. He'd make people welcome to the building. We get emails from Flying Start, who use the building, saying we just want to say how welcoming Billy was. And we ended up taking him as a paid staff member. He applied for a job after 6 months with us, and he was the caretaker, but was so much more than that. He's just finished with us now after 5 years and is moving on to other things. And it was totally transformational for him. After years and years of unemployment and ill health, he felt he was unemployable, to discover that his talents were needed and were taken up into this bigger story. And for him now, it's been transformational. His boys are now in college and studying. And that's just a good example of that personal transformation that happens through nurturing people's contribution in a community context through an asset-based approach. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to shut up. And I'll look forward to speaking to some of you in the small groups. And I'm handing over to Ollie.
Yeah, yes, thanks for the intro. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So, hello. I feel a bit of a pilgrim in a foreign land here today. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a community development worker either. I'm actually a lecturer in archaeology. But I have learnt, and the community development kind of way of working has really infused my ways of working, both academically and out when I'm working in communities. So I'm going to tell you a bit about a project that is a collaboration between ACE and the university and a whole raft of other project partners called Kaya Heritage. So this is an asset-based project that is building on the really rich heritage of this particular part of Cardiff. As Dave mentioned, Alienkairos do not have the sort of traditional economic assets, I guess, that many other communities have, such as the really big employers, those kind of things sort of left in the 1980s. But it does have a particularly rich suite of heritage assets. I mean, I guess every community has its own heritage. It's what makes places and communities unique, after all. But Alienkairos seem to have a concentration of not just regionally, not just nationally, but actually internationally significant heritage, archaeological, historic sites concentrated in this kind of smallish area of Cardiff, and all very much, well, up to a certain point, relatively undervalued or mainly underused as assets. Which they would be if, say, they were in a different community. If they were, some of these are in North Cardiff, or over in Whitchurch or something. Some of these sites would be very, very well known and well visited. Here's just a kind of a range of things I've put on this slide here, from medieval churches through to Roman villa in the park. And also, the parkland is where there's interesting modern histories, where the Cardiff racecourse used to be, where the Welsh Grand National used to be run. So there's a really interesting suite of resources. But the jewel in the crown, for me at least, is a site on the southern side of the estates. You can see there that's labelled Fort, down in the bottom middle, and that is actually what we call a hill fort. It's dates to about, or the hill fort dates to about 500 BC, so it's about 2,500 years old, and it's enormous. It's enormous, and it's very complicated, very complex architecture, and it's really, it's the biggest and most significant hill fort in this part of Southeast Wales, but nothing had ever been done with it. Partly because archaeologists like me tend to like working in very rural areas where you don't have to deal with communities, but actually another part is that there isn't a huge amount of archaeology that's been done on Iron Age sites in this region per se. Anyway, so it's got the area has got this kind of really rich heritage resource. Now I recognised. Well, I amongst others had recognised this for a long time. I was particularly interested from a research perspective in the hill fort, and I started to go out into the community to kind of speak to people, and I met Dave and other community members. And Dave, when they originally started ACE, had done a community audit and had identified the hill fort as an asset, but not really knowing what they could do with it. And so kind of we made that link between the university and ACE, and that kind of link has been at the heart of everything that we do. We've kind of learned off each other and drawn from each other's networks and skills and experiences, and been able to bring in a whole set of other project partners to work on a whole raft of different activities and various projects over the years. So we started back in 2011, so it's been going for a long time now, and it's, as I said, it's a collaborative project between the university, ACE, but also local schools, other heritage organisations, local residents, local groups, local community groups, and a whole raft of other interested individuals and organisations. Everything that we do, we attempt to use the co-production principles. So it's not about the university parachuting in and doing something, then going away again. Everything, all the activities we do are co-produced to some extent. Are they completely bottom up? No, probably not. Are they completely top down? Definitely not. We were kind of a middle way project, but we aspire to be much more bottom up than top down. We had at the outset a kind of a range of underpinning objectives. And again, these were co-produced from conversations and meetings we were having when we bring people around the table. But at the top of that list was kind of trying to foster a different sense of place for the communities in this area, trying to tell that sort of different story that Dave was talking about. But we also saw a whole range of other opportunities, providing educational, also what we call new life opportunities, building social capital, social networks, promoting skills developments, raising interest in local heritage and kind of putting it on people's agendas, not only in Cairo, but kind of wider afield in Cardiff. And also for me, I'm passionate about people coming to university. So a big part of this was about breaking down barriers to higher education. Very few people from this area go on to university, and I believe it can change your life. So I want more people to come through.
2 minutes, Ollie.
2 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll go through to some of the methods. So we've involved people in every aspect of the project, from undertaking internationally significant research. You've got individuals and organizations here, school groups involved in excavations and other historical research, which then generates positive news stories about the area, builds confidence in those individuals involved. We work very closely with the schools, particularly the secondary schools in the area, but also the primaries, about kind of widening participation, curriculum development. So we're actually developing resources about local history and heritage for the schools to use. Adult learners too, so it's not just school children or people of school children age, it's adults engaging with the project, and engaging both formally and informally. So we run a whole suite of accredited adult learners courses. We've run maybe 7 or 8 now, got a whole load more in the pipeline. These are run at what the university calls level 0, so, well, level 3 now. But it's a way of getting people back into education, particularly targeted at those who have been out of education for a very long time, called the Live Local, Learn Local scheme. And the idea is that we try and bring people through who want, well, part of it is about raising confidence and things like that, but it's also about potentially bringing people through to higher education. A number have gone on to what we call pathway to degree, and then subsequently a number have actually gone on to degree as well over the years. So it's been quite a successful part of the project. Just sort of mentioning here that, yeah, it's not just history and archaeology. You know, we engage people in all sorts of different ways, through creativity, through art in particular. Art is a fantastic way of getting people kind of thinking about things that they didn't really, you know, want to think about in other ways, perhaps. And we work with a range of kind of local and national artists. Volunteering too is a key part of what we do. So it's not just about doing excavations or doing research. It's about working with people to improve the management and the kind of the aesthetic of the historic sites in this area, to try and encourage more people to come and visit them, and in doing so come and see what the area is actually, you know, kind of try and break down those kind of barriers to why people don't necessarily come to Cairo and Ely. So we have got a range of quite successful volunteer groups where individuals come and get involved in things like conservation, pathway creation or management, and a whole range of community-led campaigns that are trying to address some of the issues that the site like Cairo Hill Fort suffers from, antisocial behaviour and those kinds of things. So we kind of do that regularly and kind of keep up that regular contact. We're at the moment, we were kind of running these on a weekly basis, but obviously during lockdown that was significantly harder. Just going to finish with, I've got 2 more slides, and I think they're reasonably important. So I'm just going to finish with these, just to think about some of these kind of project outcomes. You know, we've got the traditional academic outcomes, which perhaps are less important for many people on here. But you know, in terms of kind of social outcomes, you know, huge numbers of people actually involved in the project. You know, almost 4,000 active participants in a project activity. Huge numbers of different institutional partners involved, and in doing so kind of creating wider and wider social networks or social capital for the peoples involved. And then there's that idea of progression as well, managing to progress people through to higher education from an area where very few people go on to do higher education. So, you know, some really tangible outcomes from this project, which have been, you know, I think the sentence at the top there is probably quite important. Mutual benefits from long-term commitment. I don't think any of this would be possible without us having been working in this area for a very long time, almost 10 years now, and that continued kind of relationship. And finally, just kind of pick up on, I might leave this up for a couple of minutes so you can read them for yourselves, really, just to pick up on what Dave was saying about most significant change and the way that people tell their own stories and what they think is significant. And here's just a few examples of those stories from this project. And you can see that it kind of, you know, the stories you get sort of focus on different aspects. For some people, the thing that's really important is the site itself, the heritage, the place. For other people, the most significant thing is about getting involved in something and building that confidence back up, feeling valued about what they're doing and what they can give, and seeing that other people value what they can give to the project. So there's a whole range of these that we've actually managed to get now. And I love some of these, the way that we can kind of reflect back on some things that you think, actually, you know, for me as an academic, I didn't think that was very important, but actually for someone else, it's massively important. So, you know, one of the excavations, a 6-year-old was with us on the site and found one of the first Neolithic, really, really important artifact they found, and they managed, you know, they took it to a professor who was standing nearby and had a conversation with that professor about this object. And for them, that was the kind of, you know, this is an unbelievable experience where they got to engage with an academic they would never ever, you know, perhaps engage with elsewhere. So it was, you know, those kinds of things that we can kind of tease out of this process. I've gone on for too long, I know, so I'm going to stop there. Am I handing over to Nick?
Yes, hello. Okay, those 3 fantastic presentations and so much food for thought. So one of the things, when you're being presented with such rich information, the danger is it can go in one ear out the other. So for the next 20 minutes, we want to put you into breakout rooms just to reflect and chew over some of the things that have been shared. So what we'd like to do, we also want to make sure that everybody, not just the extrovert people, get a voice and are able to say what they think. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms, and we're going to ask you to think individually and share individually in a sentence, only in one sentence or at the most 2 sentences, what strikes you most about what has been shared. So that's the question we'd like to pose to you. What strikes you most about what has been shared? And then what we would like you to do then, it might be, and it's important to point this out, that you might agree with something or disagree. So it's not you think it's all marvelous. You might actually want to challenge what's been shared. And that's why I've got this picture of the elephant metaphor. We encourage people to have different perspectives. So that's really important. And then what we'd like the group to do to feedback, we're looking at the groups running for about 20 minutes, the breakouts, and then coming back at 12. We hope you'll bear with us for the last 10 minutes to 10 past 12 for a bit of feedback. What we'd like each group to feedback on is we'd like them to agree or come up with a key message or implication for social work or social care. So it's just for each group to come up with a message or an implication for the way we do social work and social care. Is that okay? So Sian is going to put us into groups, and your question is everybody to have a little think and say what strikes you most about what has been shared. Is that okay, Sian? I'll pass over to you now to do the magic of breakout rooms. So shall I start with our little group? I think we were group 1. And one of the things that came up was just this whole thing around possibilities when you connect people, especially when you connect diverse people with different ways of seeing the world and thinking. And sometimes we said social work and social care tends to be all around pre-planning. You have your national outcomes framework, you set all your predetermined outcome measures, and you try to look at distance traveled rather than just get people together and see what happens and see what emerges and learn retrospectively. So I think our group were really keen on just look at the possibilities and think outside the box. That was a key message from our group. Would you like to pass to the next group then, Alison?
Yeah, Jan, do you want to talk from our group? Jan, you're on mute.
That is the phrase of 2020, isn't it? You're on mute. In our group, I think we had quite a few people who were already quite active within the community development work. And I think the key element for them was that it's all about that connectivity. How do you actually join with people together? And they talked about how they're already developing really good connectivity between different kind of projects and individuals within the role. But then it raised the question about how do we actually make sure that we get that happening across Wales. So those little areas of good connectivity can join together for a bigger connectivity. And something around the need for a compendium of better practice, so that people can actually learn from each other rather than reinvent the wheel. And I think the final point, which was particularly the thing that most third sector NGOs will know, is that short-term funding actually works very much against connectivity, because there's that kind of that competition or the bun fights over funding that stops that block. I think that was roughly it. Somebody can slap me across the head and remind me if I've missed any key points.
No, I think that summarised it well, Jan. Yeah. And I don't have the list of groups now, so does anyone else want to volunteer to be spokesperson for their group?
We know the list. Fiona was in a group, weren't you, Fiona?
I was in a group, a fantastic group that had a very passionate conversation. So just a couple of things. One is about what struck someone was the power of the stories and the most significant change. So that kind of method. But then we had a really good discussion about how do you keep the passion going and how do you build the momentum and sustain it and light the fire for change agents within local communities and kind of really keep it moving? And then how do you influence commissioning processes to enable those kind of processes to be kicked off and sustained? So our conversation kind of focused on that and went into all sorts of different tracks stemming from that.
And Reb, was you in a group?
Yeah, we had a really lively discussion. Sophie Buckley from PAVS is going to feedback to us about our key theme.
The lovely
Hi.
Sophie. Hello, Sophie.
Hi, hello Nick. Hi everybody. So yeah, Sue and Sandy and Reb were in the group with myself, and Sue and Sandy talked about the COVID response in our counties that we've seen, and this sort of the different responses in terms of either grassroots community action or kind of the coordination of volunteers in other counties. But basically what we felt was important was the kind of identifying assets and working alongside community groups as a supporter. You know, community groups, you know, need information sometimes, and they may need advice, and so it's important that they know where to go, but we mustn't stifle community action, but rather empower community members to use their assets and to support those around them.
Great, thank you, Sophie. And then we've got Ollie. You had a group, Ollie?
I did, yes, thanks. Well, I think that there were two main themes that came out of ours. Group members, please feel free to jump in if you think I've missed something here. And there are actually two things that have kind of already been mentioned, which is interesting. The first was kind of thinking about assets themselves. What constitutes an asset? Kind of, you know, what actually is a community asset? And so there's a whole discussion there to be unpacked, I guess, around, you know, are they economic, social, everything, you know, where does an asset begin and end, and how do we identify them? And then the second aspect was, again, picking up on Jan's point about connectivity. So there was some discussion around the potential sort of schism between social workers and community development workers, or there's at least a gap between them, and how do we kind of link them up? How do we link up community development workers with the social workers? So the idea that some social work, you know, you're taking people out of their local communities and putting them in other communities, whereas in fact, if there was that kind of link up, you might find that there are the assets, the projects, the activities going on in their own communities. And so how do we kind of link those two groups of people up better?
Brilliant. Last but not least, we've got Dave Horton and your group.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So yeah, we had a really good conversation. All kind of feedback I would give is that there was a sense that there was a desire amongst social workers to work with the individual and family in the wider context, to look at sort of the community context and wider networks and the good things and the assets already happening around that person or family. But there are challenges identified around kind of resources and caseloads and things like that. But a couple of interesting sort of areas of promise, if you like, or things we should be focused on. One was that it was pointed out we have a unique legal landscape in Wales with the Social Care and Wellbeing Act and other aspects that actually puts collectives and cooperatives and approaches like that as part of the mix. So that is there to be kind of developed and engaged with, albeit with all the challenges we already said about resources, particularly sort of post-austerity. And then the second thing is just the idea that there is a history of this, and there's an idea that we could move back to the roots of social work that are in social justice and human rights, which allow for this sort of focus on communities and on families in that wider community context. I think that was kind of a broad, quick summary, but if anyone from my group wants to chip in, they're very welcome.
I'm reminded of the philosopher Martin Buber says all real living is meeting, and the possibilities and things that happen when people connect. And so I think that's probably the prevailing message for me. I'm going to hand over to Alison, because I know people will be ready, starting to get their tummies rumbling for lunch. So Alison, did you want to close the session?
Yeah. Just to say, you know, it was really thought-provoking, really interesting, very well put together presentations, and I really, really enjoyed it. And for me personally, it really made me think about how individualistic we are in social work, which is my particular field, and how much we forget community, and how much, you know, much there is for us to be going out there and doing. So I really enjoyed it. We probably didn't have enough time to get all the discussions, but hopefully it set lots of thoughts racing, that, and people have asked a lot about the different pieces of literature from Fiona, which she has put in the chat, but Sean will send out the references to everybody who's attended. There was just one final query about a paper by David Burnham, so perhaps we could just add that piece of literature in when we send out. So thank you very, very much for coming. I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it. So on behalf of Exchange, thank you very, very much.